Hi, I'm Stephen Bauman, and in this tutorial I'm going to be teaching you the tools that I use to study proportion on a two-dimensional surface, and we're going to be looking at a very humble subject in this tutorial, and there's a really good reason for that. Studying proportions is something that requires us to practice a lot of practical tools, and we don't want to be distracted by too much detail while we're trying to focus on these concepts. Now, the great author and artist Harold Speed describes proportions this way. He says that they are the quantitative relationship of the parts to each other, but also to the whole. He goes on to say that proportions play a really important role in the way that great works of art and beautiful objects in nature present themselves to us. And so for the artist, the study of proportion should be the subject of very careful consideration. In particular, the parts of this subject that we're concerned with are the height, width, and volume of it as a whole, but also we're going to focus inside of it on the interrelationship of smaller proportions as the drawing progresses. The tools I'm going to be using to produce this drawing are primarily graphite pencils. I also have my mono zero erasers, kneaded rubber erasers from Prismacolor, and also paper stumps of varying sizes. The paper that I'm going to be drawing this on is a Stonehenge. It's an off-white color and it's stretched around a 1-inch deep cradled panel. I find that working on stretched paper this way is a really pleasing process in that it maintains its surface and shape throughout the duration of the project. The next set of tools that I want to talk about are maybe more important in that these are the conceptual tools we're going to be using in the block-in stage to describe and study the proportion of our pair. I'm going to talk a lot about angle breaks and how those angle breaks inform our ability to accountably study the gesture and construction of the subject. We can think of angle breaks as a kind of simplification of a curve, which is a much more complex design. I'm also going to talk a lot about line quality and how we're going to use different kinds of line quality accountably to describe different features of the subject. One kind of line, for instance, will describe the contour or ending of form, while another kind of line, a bit more broad and a bit softer, will describe the boundary between shadow and light, which is a kind of continuation of form. Before we start our drawings, I have to explain a couple of things. First, I want to talk about in brief how I use comparative measurements to check my proportions. It starts with choosing an initial distance with which to make that comparison. Once I have that distance, I can use that as a unit of measurement, much like an inch or a centimeter. Let's say that I want to find out the height of the subject in comparison to this unit. I would go on to check how many of those units will go into the height overall. In this way, I will have established a relationship now in between these distances that going forward will help to make sure that this part relates well to the whole. This is one example of making a comparative measurement. It's important to recall that this basic mechanic can be used in a variety of ways. If you can take a measurement of it, it can be used as a unit to compare to other distances. I want to mention here also what happens when you're making a comparison and you end up with a remainder. Not everything is going to divide equally and completely when I make comparisons. I will search for spaces that are closest to dividing well into each other, of course. So with these small remainders, I will simply eyeball the rest of the measurement, which is to say that I'm going to make an approximate guess about the similarity of those two remainder distances. Next, I want to talk about the relationship that these shadow shapes have to each other. We have to start out by considering the direction of the light source. This one is above and to the left and maybe slightly in front of our pair. The light hits the form of the pair, creating two different types of shadow edges. First, a form shadow edge, and then a cast shadow edge. The point at which the form of the pair eclipses the light source, thus creating a form shadow edge, then casts a shadow onto the plane that the pair is resting on. A very important pattern to look out for here and to remember is that the further the cast shadow edge is from the form that is casting it, the softer it tends to be. If we take a look at these two cast shadow edges, for instance, the relationship is really quite clear. I like to think of this phenomenon as a kind of pattern, and when I see a cast shadow, I'm always looking for exactly this relationship. Coming to a close on the first part of this project, we should understand that a good final version of this stage will have proportions, at least in a rough sense, in place. Meaning that all of the building blocks are there and all that is required is to shift them little by little into place. By this I mean our contours are fully designed, Each part of the pear that we intend to draw has been rendered up to the same level. Our shadow shape and a little bit of our background has been indicated from a value perspective appropriately in relationship to our subject. So we can see very clearly then the light shape, both shadow shapes, the halftone values that are there to turn the form, and that sense of completeness means that we are able to assess fully the proportional relationships, both of these smaller individual pieces and how those relate to the entirety of our subject. The takeaway here has to be not that we can create proportions on a pear, but that we can study proportions, period. The mechanics and operations of these concepts that we're applying to this pear could just as easily be applying to a portrait or a figure study. We're going to use them certainly when we're drawing, but also this is going to extend into how we measure and make comparative measurements inside of an oil painting as well. Having understood a little bit about these concepts, we also need to understand that there is a mentality involved. I think that the right attitude to take into the study of proportion is that it is a progressive study, and it requires attention from start to finish, rather than being something that we put into place and then color in the drawing around. Remember, the moment that we take our eye off of proportions and interrelationships is the moment that we allow small inaccuracies to grow unchecked.